History's strange, it's alien, and it won't give us what we would like to have.
Glad to have you with us here for Bill Mick Live. Headline at BillMick.com today, where we spent much of our first 2 hours. Journalistic prejudice. You can always catch those in the podcast section, top of the page there at BillMick.com if you missed any of that conversation. And on that show page today, we've got links to Dave Bowman, What the Frock, and Dave Does History, so a chance for you to catch up with everything Dave does, as in these Tuesday 8 o'clock hours, Dave now giving us a look at the Revolutionary War after the Declaration of Independence. Wasn't always pretty and going the way the colonies, the new states, would like it to go. Where are we heading today, Mr. Bowman?
Well, that's about the truth of it, isn't it? These first few weeks, these first few months after the Declaration of Independence, we go from this incredible high where we have declared our independence and we've made all these high-minded ideals the foundation of our nation. But all that has to be backed up with, Britain. They didn't just get up in the morning and go, well, hey, that makes sense to us, and we're okay with that. Go thine own way. No. There was a war to be fought over this, and it was a vicious war in many cases. The first year, that first 6, 8, 10 months of the American Revolutionary War after the Declaration of Independence was touch and go. I've said before that Britain really had no chance of winning this war. Logistically, they couldn't have. I'm going to amend that and say if they hadn't won it in this first 6 months, they weren't going to be able to. This is the point where they could have won it, but as things turned out, of course, they could not. When we talk about the American Revolutionary War, we tend to remember the men with the great battles, Washington at Trenton, Gates, or more precisely, Arnold at Saratoga, Daniel Morgan at Cowpens. Those are the victories that make the history books because they were important. But at this point in 1776, in the early fall, late summer of 1776, Washington and the nation had a much different problem. We had to keep the army alive. And before we could win the Revolutionary War, that was going to have to be the goal. And we talked about Fabius, the Roman general, and the American Fabian in George Washington. We've also talked in the past about this argument that, only 4 or 5 guys actually did anything, which we now know to be completely absurd. One of the people that would end up helping Washington accomplish this goal was a guy by the name of John Glover. John Glover is a Massachusetts merchantman, born in 1732. He eventually settles in Marblehead, Massachusetts, which is a fishing town. It's a town that revolves around the ocean. And he became a very successful merchant, ship owner, and when the Revolutionary began, he was already an experienced militia officer. But the important thing about Glover isn't just who he is, it's who his men were. He would command what would eventually become the 14th Continental Regiment, although history remembers them as the Marblehead Regiment. These aren't ordinary farmers who had picked up muskets and learned to march. Most of them were sailors, fishermen, ship captains, and men who had spent their entire lives working around boats and water. And this is a remarkably diverse regiment for 18th century New England. Among Glover's Marbleheaders are blacks and Native American soldiers, serving alongside the white sailors and the fishermen. They knew ropes, they knew tides, they knew boats, they understood what wind and current could do, and those skills may not sound particularly important if you're building an army, but in August of 1776, they were absolutely essential.
So, Dave, it's got me wondering, with Glover's Marblehead troops, interestingly diverse, maybe unexpected by the Brits?
Well, I certainly think that they see them, all as rebels. We talk a lot about diversity. I don't know how unexpected that would have been. It impresses us today because we don't see it that way. We assume, because we're told all the time that this was just a bunch of old white guys. It wasn't.
Well, I'm talking more specifically about these guys are guys who are used to operating on the water, and I don't think the Brits necessarily thought the colonials would have that capability, maybe.
Well, they certainly didn't think about it in this case because they had Washington surrounded. We're not going to go into all the details of the New York campaign, but it has been a disaster for the Americans. Washington made the decision to defend New York. It was driven by Congress. He didn't like the decision, but He tried to do his best, and as we talked about, the battles did not go well. And by the time we reach, mid to late August, he's been driven out of New York City. He's been driven out of Harlem. He finds himself on Long Island, and he's got a problem. To his back is the East River, and in the front of him is the British Army. And offshore is the Royal Navy. Washington has somewhere around 9,000 men. If William Howe can close the trap, the army is captured, destroyed, and the war is over. There isn't another great American army waiting somewhere else. This is it. If we lose the Continental Army here, there's no guarantee that we survive the war at all. Washington decides that, what we need to do is get out of this trap. So we're going to evacuate Long Island. But that creates a big problem. How do you move thousands of soldiers, horses, artillery, ammunition, equipment across a river at night without the British realizing what you're doing? And that's a pretty simple equation. You need boats. But more importantly, you need men who know how to handle them. Who do we have that does that? Well, John Glover and his Marblehead Regiment. Washington orders that every available boat that can be found is brought together for the evacuation. Flat-bottom boats, sloops, anything capable of carrying men is brought to the army. Then he turns to the men from Marblehead, and he says, look, I don't need soldiers right now. I need sailors. And on the night of August 29th, Glover's men begin moving Washington's army across the East River. Now, this is not some leisurely ferry operation. They're working in total darkness. They have thousands of frightened, exhausted soldiers waiting to cross, horses, artillery. All of this stuff has to be done. The units have to disappear from the front line without letting the British know that they've left. At first, even the weather seems determined to just ruin the whole thing. The wind makes the crossing difficult, but then the conditions begin to change. As the boats begin to move back and forth across the water again and again, everything seems to be going reasonably well. Washington stays over in Brooklyn. He's overseeing the evacuation. But as the morning approaches, something extraordinary happens, Bill. We've talked about this before. If you're the British and you believe God is on your side, why does God keep saving these people? Here comes the fog again. Again, the fog shows up. This is what, the third time now? The fog settles in over the American... It's August, Bill. How common is fog in August?
Yeah, there you go.
It settles in over the American positions. The British cannot see what's happening, and Glover keeps the boats moving. By the time the fog finally lifts, the British discover that the army that they had trapped and were ready to destroy is gone. Washington has escaped. He's taken with him thousands of Continental soldiers who might have spent the rest of the war, if there was one, in British prison camps, or they might have simply ceased to exist as an army. And now they're safely across the East River. Now, there are several reasons why the evacuation succeeds. Washington, of course, deserves credit for ordering it. The weather deserves credit for its work as well. But none of this happens without John Glover and the Marblehead men. This should have been his great moment of the Revolution, the night John Glover helped save Washington's army. But 7 weeks later, Washington is going to need him again. The British are going to attempt another maneuver around his army, and thousands of British and Hessian troops will come ashore north of New York City. And standing in his way will be John Glover, who has just a few hundred Continental soldiers. He doesn't have a lot. This time, there's no East River to cross. There's just a country road. And along this country road are some stone walls, not very high, a couple of feet. And a Massachusetts merchant who understands exactly what Washington needs most right now. It isn't that he needs the British Army defeated. It isn't that he needs the British Army driven back into New York. It isn't that he needs, another fog-laden miracle. What he needs is to buy time. And John Glover, much like Benedict Arnold last week, understands that. And he begins to deploy his men behind these stone walls, which is yet another way that Americans fight and continues to fight throughout our history. And these stone walls and those Marblehead men are going to buy Washington the time that he needs to get everything settled and to save his army yet again from destruction by the British.
And John Glover coming in handy to Washington on multiple occasions. How cool that story is. We continue with it in moments as we resume Dave Does History when we come back on Bill Mick Live right here on 92.7 FM UMN.
From muskets to microphones, the story carries on. This is Dave Does History right here on Bill Mick Live.
And Dave, as we talk about John Glover and repeatedly buying time with the help of Providence or fog, a couple of those occasions, now he's facing a ground battle as opposed to being on the water. And he's a key to keeping this revolution intact.
It's remarkable how many of these people we have just forgotten about. And of course, historians know these stories and we try to bring them to you, but it's just sad to me sometimes how much we've forgotten of our history. And it's also interesting to me, and I almost feel like this needs to be a white paper, this idea of, God is on our side, and yet he keeps helping the other side with fog is remarkable to me. So after Glover and his Marbleheaders had gotten the army out of across the East River, we're still actually on Manhattan Island. We're just withdrawing to the north. Now, William Howe, General Howe of the British, has an opportunity here. He can attack Washington directly, or he can try to flank him. And he decides to go for that flanking move and move his army up the island, try to land behind him, and cut off the route across the Hudson so that Washington can't retreat that way. Now, Washington did understand this, and he began shifting his army back to the north. But moving an army in the 18th century is not a quick process for either side. Thousands of men have to march, artillery has to be moved, ammunition has to be carried, roads become, it's not unlike, war today. It's the same problem that you have. Howe has the same problem Washington has. Washington's trying to move north, Howe's trying to move north. And again, they're trying to do these things that aren't working very well. By October, General Howe will decide that he's going to try an amphibious landing. We tend to think of that as something new, but it's not. And he's going to try this amphibious landing at a place called Pell's Point, New York. And he's going to send about 4,000 troops, Hessians primarily, to make this landing to try to cut behind Washington's army. But in the way, as we said, was John Glover, who had been posted in the area with his brigade. And when word came that the enemy troops were landing, he rode out to see what was happening. He climbed up as high as he could get, looking through his telescope, and what he saw was not encouraging. The British troops were pouring ashore in waves. More boats were coming, more soldiers were landing. Glover estimated the troops at about several thousand men, and he has somewhere around 750, if that many. Now, anybody can do math. You can see that those are not good odds. But Glover understands that his job is not to defeat Howe's army. It's simply to slow it down. And somewhere behind him, George Washington is moving men, guns, and horses and supplies towards White Plains, New York. Every hour matters. So Glover looks at the ground, and this is where he realizes that countryside is divided up by stone walls.
So Glover has some ideas, Dave, and he is going to delay the Brits here, which is going to be a big help to Washington as he's trying to accomplish his movement.
Think about this from the British perspective. I mean, you've just come ashore there with several thousand Hessian professional German troops. The Americans have been retreating for weeks. Your commanders know that Washington is retreating. And now there's this small, tiny brigade of force in front of you where you've just landed. What you don't expect is for these Americans to use tactics that are not common in the 18th century.
Guerrilla warfare.
Well, you'd think they'd know after Lexington and Concord. You'd think they'd know. But again, lessons learned didn't seem to be a thing to them. These stone walls provide Glover with an opportunity, and he begins to deploy his troops in what we would refer to as deployment in depth. He doesn't put everybody behind the first wall and wait for that wall to get overrun. He puts a few men at that wall, a few men behind the second wall, so forth and so on. And as the British begin to advance, the Americans start shooting. After they fire a round or two, they fall back to the next wall. The natural response is to keep going, and so the British keep going. And that's exactly what Glover wants them to do. As the first American detachment withdraws to the next defensive position, the British follow along. Then they encounter another line of Continental soldiers waiting behind the stone wall. Americans fire from behind that, and the British have to stop. They have to deploy. They have to return fire. They have to organize an attack. And by the time they do, the Americans pull back. And then the British have to reform to move forward again. What do they find when they move forward again? Another wall, another American regiment, another volley, another delay. This is what Glover has managed to create. He's not creating an impenetrable defensive line. He's making the British repeatedly solve the same problem. Again, we don't think in terms of 18th century tactics. It wasn't just a hell's bells rush to things. They had to advance as a unit. You've seen this in Civil War movies where the officer is standing out in front waving his sword and stuff like that. He's directing all of this stuff to happen. They didn't have radios. They didn't have training. They didn't have all those kinds of things. So every time they get to one of these walls, the British have to do the advance. They have to deploy for the attack. They have to make the attack. Then they have to reorganize after the attack. Then they have to reform up to advance again. And every time they do this, the clock keeps running. One of Glover's...
So they've made this piece of ground, Dave, seem more valuable than it actually is to the Americans.
Much more valuable than it is.
Yeah.
And this fighting withdrawal is something that up to this point in history really hasn't been successfully like this done. One of Glover's regiments, the 3rd Continental, takes up a particularly strong position, and the Americans open it at very close range. That fighting becomes very intense. The British push forward, and instead of withdrawing this time, the Americans continue shooting. Contemporary accounts describe sustained volleys as the two sides fight across these little pieces of Westchester, New York farmland. And eventually the pressure builds and it becomes too much, and Glover knows that he can't remain there indefinitely. He's outnumbered many times over. If he allows his brigade to become fixed in place, the British can bring their superior numbers to work. So he does what every disciplined commander knows how to do. He withdraws. He didn't run. His men fall back through the defensive positions they've already prepared. They continue to make the British work for the ground, and eventually Glover pulls his brigade away. The British have won the battle. Yay! And if all you do is look at who took the ground, then sure, they won. But that's not how you measure this battle. The objective was time. And Glover made sure that they simply didn't march through unopposed. He made sure that while they lost the battle at Pell's Point, they cost the British all the time that they didn't have.
We wrap it up and let you talk to Dave when we continue on Bill Mick Live, 321-768-1240. We continue in moments on UMN.
This is Dave Does History on Bill Mick Live.
And Dave, I think the interesting thing that we're learning in all of this, and especially as we talk these various maneuvers by John Glover in helping Washington escape on multiple occasions, that winning the battle is not necessarily winning the war, and you got to have the overall goal in mind to be successful. And he was instrumental here.
That's a lesson that often repeats throughout history is the war. I mean, are you in this for the long haul, or are you in this to win battles? And winning battles doesn't necessarily win wars. And I think we could sit here and spend the next 2 hours talking about examples of that through history, but we don't have that kind of time.
Right.
This whole process in this late summer, early fall of 1776 is absolutely critical to America's survival. The fact that we have a nation today is because John Glover saw something that no one else could see and managed to use that defensive position to slow the British down, to annoy them. their complaints after Lexington and Concord about how the Americans weren't fighting the way we're supposed to fight. Well, why would we when you get right down to it? This whole delay thing.
Complaining to the referee that the Americans don't know the rules.
They're writing. There's some nasty letters that they're writing home about how unmanly and ungentlemanly we are. But it all connects even back last week when we talked about Valcour Island and the fact that while these are two very different battles, Pell's Point and Valcour Island, one's a naval battle, one's a land battle. Both of them fought, by the way, by sailors who happen to be, running infantry. They're both designed to accomplish the same strategic purpose, which is to slow the British down. Neither Arnold nor Glover can defeat the British. They can't destroy them. They can't do any of those things. They know the job is to delay the stronger enemy, preserve something more important than the battlefield itself. And Washington's ability after this battle at Pell's Point is he will withdraw to another place known as White Plains. You've probably heard that name, White Plains, New York. It's a city there now. And it's here that we will fight yet another battle in the American Revolutionary War. Glover's story illustrates for us the central reality of 1776. Washington does not have the ability, nor does he have the need to defeat the British Army in a direct stand-up battle. Although he wants to, Washington has written...
It's an interesting take, though. He doesn't need to defeat him.
No, he doesn't need to. He just has to... And yet he has written, back when he was in Boston during the spring, he was writing letter after letter. He was having war conference after war conference. He wanted that battle with Britain. He wanted that smackdown, let's go 12 full rounds heavyweight battle. And everybody kept telling him, yeah, that's not a good idea. And it drove him nuts. I mean, he really wanted that. But the central reality is he doesn't need to do that. All he has to do is keep the British from destroying his army. And if he keeps doing that, then eventually this whole thing is going to go the way the Americans want it to go, which is something that I don't think anybody even realized at that point. The whole idealism of the American Revolution with the Declaration of Independence, we have all these great ideas. And I wonder sometimes if there wasn't some astonishment at the fact that the British didn't look at this and go, well, yes, you're right. I guess we should go along with it. Because logically, it makes sense. Internally, logically, it makes sense. We were using the same arguments that the British themselves had used against Charles II and James I. It wasn't like we were reinventing the wheel. And so now we're sitting here with these two armies fighting each other across Manhattan Island as they go up this stuff. And it's eventually going to lead to an accomplishment secondary to none in the history of the world. Now, John Glover will continue to serve as an officer in the Continental Army. He will command his Marblehead again, and they will actually become very critical later on. If you're paying attention at all, if you know anything about American history, you know that there is another river crossing in our very near future. Well, who do we have that's expert in crossing rivers at this particular point?
We seem to know this guy.
Yes, we do. And so he will return stage center come Christmas time here in this campaign. Glover will become a general, and he will go on to serve his country very, very well. As for that battle at White Plains that Glover and Arnold have bought time for, Arnold has caused, up at Valcour Island, he has caused the British to abandon their 1776 campaign down into New York. And by the time 1777 rolls around, a year from now, in August of 77, they're going to face a very different American army than they would have faced had they continued going. And so Arnold accomplished that. Here, the British have reached White Plains, delayed successfully by Glover, giving Washington time to entrench at White Plains. And that battle will become this bloody slugfest. Once again, the British will win the battle. in the sense that they will hold the field at the end of the Battle of White Plains. But once again, they also will not destroy Washington's army because he manages to pull back yet again. And once again, Bill, guess who shows up to make sure Washington can escape? Our old friend Providence, who sends a huge rainstorm that keeps the British from moving again. At some point, don't you have to say, look, we believe God is on our side, but he keeps saving these people and we just don't get it. What are we doing here? And yet that never seems to occur. Of course, it never occurs to anybody in war that God might not actually be on your side. And I guess we'd have to say, well, God was on our side. Well, although we're going to lose the battle at White Plains, the withdrawal will continue. And Washington will maintain that army, and he will keep it alive long enough to make it to winter quarters, secure for the year. And it's there in this winter of our discontent, when things are at their absolute lowest. We've lost battle after battle after battle, withdrawal after withdrawal after withdrawal, that our old friend Thomas Paine will show up yet again and inform us that these are the times that try men's souls.
Let's get a quick call in while we can. Dave, line 1, you're up on Bill Mick Live. Good morning.
Good morning, Bill. This is Barry in Palm Bay.
Yeah, Barry.
You know, Glover's tactics of hit and run may have been old, but they lasted a long time. You take a look at World War II. You had Merrill's Marauders, you had the Devil's Brigade. The hit and run tactic was still very good in World War II and probably in Korea as well. And the thing is that you put a thorn in the enemy's side and he can't concentrate on what he's doing. He's fighting off all these thorns that are giving him all kinds of problems.
Yeah, that's a good point, Barry. And I guess, Dave, lessons learned here from what Glover had done repeatedly.
When we get to World War II, one of the complaints that the Germans will have is that Americans don't seem to fight the way they're supposed to fight. They don't seem to have a plan. And even if they do have a plan, they don't seem to follow it. So how can you actually predict what they're going to do? How do you fight them? And the British had the same problem along the way.
Well, I guess it's good to be unpredictable in that circumstance then.
Yeah. It accomplished our goals. And that, again, even with the Marblehead, even with Glover, it wasn't so much hit and run as it just was deployment in depth and pulling back and pulling back and pulling back. And
forcing them to fight an unnecessary battle, basically.
Right. Which again, in the 18th century, we just don't comprehend how much that required. You had to form up. You had to deploy. You didn't march in the same formation that you fought in. And so you'd have to form up and reform up. You want to know why there's captains and lieutenants and sergeants and corporals in armies? Because their job was to make sure that these formations would be correct so that you could march and fight properly. And each one of them had a job.
And you also forced that British enemy to expend resources that they didn't necessarily expect to expend in that fashion.
Not just that, but not that they didn't expect to expend, but they couldn't afford to expend. Remember, they still have the same logistical problem they had in Boston. They still have to move all their supplies all the way from England, 3,000 miles across the Atlantic. And oh, by the way, winter is coming.
Yeah, that's very, very true. Weather in that winter, stories about it, and I'm sure we're going to get there at some point. Is there still optimism in the colonies about this at this time, Dave?
There is a lot of optimism. There's a lot of belief that we're going to succeed, primarily because what we are doing in the background, go all the way back to May 10th, and the May 10th resolves. What we're doing in the background is we are negotiating with other countries. France, particularly, we really want France on our side, but other countries as well. Holland, the Netherlands, is supplying most of our powder. In direct defiance of England, by the way. They're an ally of England, and they're doing that. And Spain is actually beginning to not necessarily be on our side per se, but they kind of go along with France. And if France decides to take on England, France is going to go with that. Spain is going to go with that. So England is facing a huge problem right now. And even King George recognizes this. In his speech before Parliament this year, he's going to acknowledge the fact that this is rapidly turning into an unmanageable world war, but he has confidence that God will see them through. Not making that up. You can read his speech for yourself. He has confidence that God will support them, despite the evidence that God is clearly not on your side, dude. I don't know how to tell you this, but he's not.
Might support him in the war, but not through the fog, which God is sending.
Or the rain.
That makes all kinds of sense, does it not?
Certainly does to me.
Yep. You have a look at where we're going next week, Dave?
We are headed into that winter encampment that we're going to face. And that winter encampment, this is not Valley Forge, by the way. This is the first winter encampment. And it's uncomfortable, and there's smallpox, and there's Thomas Paine. And we're gonna head into that winter encampment, and we're gonna take a detailed look at the American Crisis, Paine's second pamphlet, which
and
may
those
have been better
ordered
than first.
inoculations that we talked about that didn't have needles to do it.
Nope. Nice.
Ugh. Dave Bowman, always an interesting day with Dave Does History. Thank you, my friend. Look forward to talking next week.
Looking forward to it.
Check out more stories from history at davedoeshistory.org.